A few summers ago, I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I'd always enjoyed the outdoors, and after a stressful few weeks at work, I figured a quiet weekend in nature would help me clear my head. I chose a remote campsite in a forest a few hours from home. It wasn't a popular spot, which was part of the appeal. I'd have the place to myself, surrounded by nothing but trees and fresh air. The first day was peaceful. I set up my tent, started a fire, and spent the evening relaxing. By the time night fell, the forest was eerily quiet, but I didn't mind. I had brought a book and some snacks, and I figured I'd stay up for a while before turning in. Around 10 p.m., I heard something unusual. It wasn't the sound of animals or the wind. It was a voice. Faint, but distinct. It sounded like someone was calling out in the distance, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. At first I thought it might be another camper, but that didn't make sense. The site was remote, and I hadn't seen another car or person all day. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. The voice came again, closer this time. I stood up, scanning the darkness with my flashlight, but I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. The sound stopped, and after a few minutes, I decided it wasn't worth worrying about. I went to bed, trying to shake off the unease, but in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow and deliberate, circling around me. I held my breath, frozen, listening as they moved closer. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call out, but fear kept me silent. After what felt like forever, the footsteps stopped. I waited, heart pounding, until I finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find the area around my campsite undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. I tried to brush off what had happened as a bad dream, but something about the way the footsteps had sounded stuck with me. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me felt ridiculous. I'd driven all this way, and I didn't want to cut my trip short over something I couldn't even explain. So I decided to stay, figuring daylight would help me shake the unease. The day passed uneventfully. I hiked a nearby trail, made lunch, and spent the afternoon by the fire. But as the sun started to set, the uneasy feeling returned. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. That night, I sat by the fire, trying to keep my mind occupied. Then, I heard it again. The voice. It was closer this time, low and faint, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I grabbed my flashlight and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. I stood there for a while, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anything. The voice stopped, and after a few minutes, I forced myself to sit back down. But then I saw it. Just beyond the firelight, there was a shape. A figure, standing perfectly still among the trees. My stomach dropped. I couldn't make out any details, but it was unmistakable. I called out again, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Panic set in. I grabbed my keys and slowly backed toward my car, keeping my flashlight trained on the spot where the figure was. But when I reached the car and turned back, the figure was gone. I didn't waste any more time. I jumped into the car, started it, and drove away as fast as I could. I never went back to that campsite. I've told myself it was just another camper playing a prank, or maybe my imagination running wild. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Whatever, or whoever I saw that night wasn't there by accident. It was waiting. Last fall, I decided to go camping alone for the first time. Life had been overwhelming. Work, family, everything. And I needed an escape. I'd heard about a small, secluded camping spot deep in a forest, about 3 hours from my house. It wasn't marked on most maps, but that was the appeal. The first day was uneventful. The trail was quiet, and the forest felt untouched. By late afternoon, I'd set up my tent near a small clearing and spent the evening watching the sunset over the trees. The isolation was exactly what I needed. Around 9 p.m., I started hearing faint sounds in the distance. At first, I thought it was just animals. The forest can be noisy at night, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But something about these sounds felt deliberate, like footsteps. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just on edge from being alone. But as the night went on, the footsteps became clearer. They weren't constant, just a few steps, then silence, then a few more. It felt like someone, or something, was pacing around my campsite, staying just out of sight. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped for a while, and I eventually convinced myself to lie down in the tent. But just as I started to drift off, I heard a faint, steady tapping on one of the trees near my tent. It wasn't loud, but it was rhythmic, deliberate. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I woke up exhausted but determined to stay another day. Part of me wanted to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving early would feel like admitting defeat. I spent the day exploring nearby trails, trying to focus on anything but the unease from the night before. By the time I returned to my campsite, I felt a little better. I convinced myself that the noises had been my imagination, or maybe an animal. That night, though, things got worse. Around 10 p.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, closer. They circled my campsite, stopping and starting like someone, or something, was watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped for a while, and I tried to calm down. But then, I heard a voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, coming from somewhere in the trees. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded like someone calling my name. I froze. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, and I was miles from the nearest town. There was no way someone could know I was out here. The voice came again, clearer this time. It wasn't calling my name, but it was speaking in a low, calm tone, like it was trying to lure me out of the tent. I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, listening. Then the tent shifted. It was subtle, like someone had brushed against it. I grabbed my car keys, unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, and bolted for my car. I didn't look back. I started the engine and drove down the dirt road, my heart racing. When I got back to civilization, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was another camper, maybe it was a prank, but deep down I knew better. I haven't been camping alone since. Every now and then, I think about that voice, the deliberate way it spoke, the footsteps that circled my tent. I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't human. A few years back, I decided I needed a break from everything. Work was stressful and I felt like I was suffocating in the noise of city life. I found an isolated camping spot online, deep in the woods where very few people ever went. The reviews were sparse, mostly from people who said it was peaceful and off the beaten path. I liked that idea. I wanted solitude. The first day passed without issue. I set up my tent, collected firewood, and spent the evening sitting by the fire, enjoying the stillness of the forest. But as the sun dipped below the trees, I began to notice a change. The woods seemed quieter, too quiet. There were no crickets, no distant calls of birds, just silence. By 9 p.m., I was sitting in the tent reading a book when I heard something from outside. It started as a faint rustling, then grew to what sounded like footsteps moving around my campsite. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. It wasn't an animal. It was heavier, more deliberate. Someone was walking around. I called out, "Hey, who's there?" The noise stopped abruptly. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing came. I told myself it was probably just an animal, or my mind playing tricks on me. I convinced myself to stay calm. But as I lay back in my sleeping bag, I felt an undeniable sense that I wasn't alone. I could hear the footsteps again, circling the tent. This time, they were slower, like whoever it was waiting for me to make a move. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. The next morning, the woods were as still as they had been the night before. The footprints outside my tent were faint, but they were there. Too big and too human-like to be from any animal I knew. I debated leaving, but part of me didn't want to admit that I was scared. I decided to stay another night, thinking I might be overreacting. I told myself it was probably a hiker who got lost or something, and that it was all just coincidence. That evening, as the sun set and shadows grew longer, I felt the fear creep back in. I didn't want to be alone in the woods at night, but turning back now seemed pointless. I sat by the fire, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, I heard it. A voice, low and rough, whispering just beyond the light of the fire. It was saying something I couldn't make out, but it was unmistakably close. My heart pounded. I called out, "Who's there?" The voice stopped. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the dark. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like the forest itself was closing in on me. And then I heard it again, behind me this time. I spun around, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the silence of the trees. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my backpack, threw it over my shoulder, and ran to my car. The forest seemed to come alive with noises behind me. The crunch of feet, a distant snap of branches, and that low whisper that followed me all the way to my car. I drove out of there as fast as I could, never looking back. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station, hours later, where I finally let myself breathe. The memory of the voice, the footsteps, and that feeling of being watched never left me. I never went back to those woods, and I never camped alone again. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. All I know is that I left before it could make its move.